theme that is at the core of the World Economic Forum's mission, which is creating global cooperation, and in particular to look at what's going wrong with it today and what can be done to promote it. And I'm going to start by pointing out that when the World Bank and IMF meetings took place this spring in Washington, something almost unprecedented happened, which is that the G20 economic and finance ministers did manage to meet. There was some question about whether that would even happen under the Indonesian presidency in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the blackballing of Russia. But although they met, a third of the group walked out and they failed to issue a statement, which is striking not just because you have this display of dissent, but because if there was ever a time you need finance ministers and economic ministers around the world to work together, it is right now, given the world faces not just geopolitical risks, but severe inflation, rising food prices, climate change challenges, pandemic challenges, the list goes on. And even in really practical issues, which are very technical but need cooperation right now, like how to resolve emerging market debt, they couldn't come together and actually hammer anything out. And that, for me, is a terrific metaphor for what's going on right now and the challenges that we face, and the challenges that, frankly, we're going to try and talk about in this panel. We have a fantastic group of people to express their views on this, two in government, two in the private sector. Starting on my immediate right, we have His Excellency Khalid Al-Faleh, who is a Minister of Investment at Saudi Arabia from the Kingdom, previously working in the private sector, so brings both perspectives to bear. We have Dr. Richard Hatchett, who's the CEO of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovations from Norway, who's going to be talking to us about what is possibly one bright spot of collaboration, which is pandemic and medical issues. We have State Secretary Mrs. Livia Louis from the Swiss Foreign Affairs Department, who's going to be telling us how we can actually look at collaboration from the perspective of a country that's not just small, but has managed to overcome some remarkable divisions inside Switzerland to show that collaboration can happen. And Anne-Marie Slaughter, who is now with the Chief Executive of New America USA, previously in Washington. So, great set of perspectives. And I would like to start with you, perhaps. Before we start actually talking amongst ourselves, I wanted to begin to set the stage by asking everyone in the room to get involved too. We have, I hope you've all got Slido, and if you haven't, do try and give you a couple of minutes to look up Slido on your phones, because apart from the fact I'd love to incorporate your questions on Slido as we have this discussion, I'd like to start with a poll and ask you all to express an anonymous, let me stress, anonymous view. This isn't going to impact your chances of getting a job in the future at a multilateral group. But I'd like to start by asking you all a question about where you think we are today. 3 questions. Firstly, I'm going to tell you the questions, then ask the first one. Do you trust the UN to act as a mechanism for global cooperation? Second question will be, do you trust the G20 to act as a mechanism for global cooperation? And the third question is, would the world be better if the UN and G20 were abolished? So let's start with the first. Do you think that the UN is a good mechanism for collaboration or not? Okay, 50-50.
Really? 50-50? Oh, no.
No, we're still moving. Tucker Carlson is not voting, so... This is better than any amount of reality TV pop show, isn't it? No? When do we know when it's finished? Maybe one organizer can tell me. Do we want to stop now with an optimistic, narrowly optimistic perspective? Okay, well, I think the UN is just squeaking through. Question 2, G20. Are we any more optimistic about the G20? Do we think that is going to be a good mechanism for global cooperation or not? This is my way of checking that you haven't all fallen asleep after lunch. We don't actually have the number who are actually voting. The voter participation rate in terms of democracy is not actually on display yet.
Exactly.
It's got to be higher than the U.S.
And the UN?
It's the UN.
Yeah. Give it a couple more minutes. Anyone else not yet voted?
50-50.
50-50.
It's a tie.
Okay, clearly the UN officials are all sitting here voting as well. Okay, last question is this. Would the world be better if we just got rid of both? And either everyone's so stunned. Oh. This is not exactly a neutral audience, given that we are at Davos. I think if we were to do a poll on Fox TV right now, we might get a different view. Not that I don't, you know.
It's interesting. You would.
Okay. All right, well, that's pretty clear-cut. So we want to hang on to the UN and the G20. We, by narrow margin, think the UN is doing the world more good than bad, but the G20 is a bit more iffy. Richard, you have, or Dr. Hatchett, you have been working in what in some ways has been an area of almost good news in terms of global collaboration on the pandemics in the last couple of years. You know, one thing I'm always stunned by is this explosion of collaboration between scientists and the degree to which you've never seen this level of real-time sharing of information and ideas around the world, not just between countries, but between rival institutions. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is much of that did not happen with government structures. So tell us, are you encouraged or discouraged about global cooperation, and what would you like to do?
So, I think you're right. I mean, the crisis did galvanize the scientific community, and the scientific response was the most impressive part of the global response. And as you begin to aggregate and move up to the state level, obviously cooperation, we certainly had some successes. I represent an organization that helped with Gavi and WHO and UNICEF to establish COVAX, which was focused on delivering and sharing vaccines, but that effort ran into tremendous difficulties, and ultimately we ended up with significant inequity in terms of access to countermeasures, which has undoubtedly prolonged the pandemic, increased the number of people who've died, and increased the cost of the pandemic to the global economy. So I think the pandemic presented a very specific cooperation problem, and the world partially stepped up to that challenge. I think it's important in understanding why cooperation wasn't perfect. It had some good aspects, but why it wasn't perfect had a lot to do with how the system was configured and how institutions were empowered at the beginning of the pandemic. And that initial configuration contributed a lot to the outcomes that we experienced. I think if we change the configuration of the system, we can make cooperation easier, and there are some relatively straightforward fixes that could allow both countries and the different sectors to collaborate with each other more effectively in the future. Maybe I'll get into that a little bit later.
Well, I'd love to. Before we do, though, I'd like to put you on the spot.
Yep.
And say, are you in the camp that thinks that the crisis showed that the WHO cannot do the job and we need a new organization? Or are you in the camp who says, actually, we need to put resources into the WHO, work with what we've got, and actually try and bolster that? Where do you sit on that? Because I've had people tell me absolutely emphatically, the UN failed, the WHO failed, we should blow the whole system up and start again from scratch.
I think that would be absolutely unproductive. I am much more in the camp of we need to strengthen the systems that we have. The WHO encountered challenges, but as I said, the system was stacked against it at the beginning. I don't think that multilateral collaboration only through multilateral organizations or only at the state level is the solution. So I think we have to have a much more robust, holistic concept of how we cooperate and how we plan and prepare. Because if we plan and prepare adequately, then cooperation in a crisis is a lot easier than if we're creating systems like COVAX after the crisis has begun.
Right, interesting. I must say, I do find the story of the scientists one of the most encouraging things that I've seen in recent years. And I've spoken to a lot of them, and the way they all got on Zoom and spoke to people who they've been competing with viciously, and suddenly they didn't all sing Kumbaya or whatever the scientific equivalent is, but they suddenly started talking to each other.
Eureka.
Eureka, exactly. Which was amazing, but that's encouraging. I should say, by the way, I'm very keen to have questions from the audience, but I'm going to have to ask one of the organisers to take away this device, and I pressed the wrong button. So collaboration does not work if you press the wrong button. Meanwhile, so if someone can come and grab it from me and just press the right button again, and I can read your questions on Slido. Minister Al-Falih, what do you think about the G20? How would you have voted if we'd asked you to vote on whether it's doing more harm than good? And do you think that it's possible to develop more efficient ways of collaboration in particular areas?
Absolutely. First of all, let me say that there were periods in 2020 when we thought that the world as we know it is ending and it's all doom and gloom, and this pandemic is going to be a permanent disruptor. But here we are, meeting again in person, without masks, and having great conversations about important topics like this. So I am optimistic, and I also celebrate the successes that have been made. Short of expectations, as they may have been, yet they're notable, and I think we should use what worked, double up on it, and fix the things that didn't work. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia happened to be presiding over the G20, and we entered 2020 having received the presidency from Japan with a completely different agenda than what we ultimately undertook in early 2020 with the onset of COVID and what became a 2-year pandemic. And the agility of the kingdom, but more importantly, the multilateral platform that the G20 provided is the reason why we're here. We provided a lot of platforms. We supported CEPI, Gavi, and other vaccine mechanisms. There was a lot of healthy dialogues, hundreds of meetings, ministerial level, 2 summits, and at the expert levels took place under the G20 during 2020 and 2021 under the presidency of Italy that helped the world navigate and get to where we are. In terms of overall framework of emergency response and crisis management, if I may step a little bit from just being locked on the pandemic and COVID, because we have other crises emerging today. You mentioned the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We in the Middle East, unfortunately, live in an area where we always have geopolitical and security risk and disruptions to our supply chains, including the energy supply chains, if you recall. And I happen to have worked at Saudi Aramco in the energy field of Saudi Arabia, and now in the broader government. And I know a thing or two about being prepared for the inevitable crisis that will hit us. And many of those tenets of being prepared and being able to manage crisis worked during COVID, and they work also on managing other types of crisis. And I would say that something that touches on the reason why we voted the way we did in the audience and why the things happen in Washington is the underlying foundation for being able to manage crisis is having a deep reservoir of trust between all of the stakeholders, whether it's between a government and its people, between organizations, whether they're public or private or non-profit organizations and their stakeholders, and then certainly between states as we work, and between the states and the multilateral organizations like the United Nations, and helping unplug some of the problems and bureaucracies that we find. Another factor that I learned from my engineering days, almost four decades managing a complex engineering organization, is in any system you have to build contingency. You have to build a spare capacity, which is something we do well in the oil and gas industry. And I did it when I was Minister of Health. We had the MERS, and at that time, this is another form of coronavirus. We built excess capacity for ICU rooms across all of Saudi Arabia, and we kept it excess, costing us money, okay, for the day that we may have a wave of infection. And it came in very handy. Saudi Arabia never exceeded 20% utilization of our ICU capacity. The third tenet is having very robust systems. These are IT systems, management system, trace and track systems for COVID, but systems that are built on technologies and procedures and then stress testing them and trying them
Right.
when things are going good, because they'll come to use an emergency, and then having a constant dialogue, and which is ultimately bring you back to trust, which is the first tenet.
Right, right. So it's, trust, slack, good management. None of those things are particularly present in the world today, unfortunately, but that's a good way of putting it. We're going to turn around later on and talk about some of the tangible issues that need collaboration now. We're already getting questions, for example, about the food crisis, so I want to talk about that later on. But I'd like to turn to you, Secretary Loy, and ask you, as a small country, which is not part of the big beast groups like G20, how do you assess the level of systems for collaboration right now? And what do you think are the key areas where you want to see, if you had a wish list of 1 or 2 areas that you're really concerned about?
Thank you very much. Well, we see, of course, multilateralism as a very important instrument for crisis management. We have in Geneva 42 international organizations, plus some 400 NGOs. So we have an ecosystem that is very close, covering a whole range of questions. And I think that is actually very helpful to bringing crisis preparation forward. In the pandemic, I think the WHO, besides the criticism that it had to endure, it also made some very positive and concrete initiatives. For example, the ACTA initiative that really brought forward the vaccination in countries around the world. So I think that shows that even an organization that has a lot of challenges, when it gets its act together, it can really go ahead. So I think that's very important. We also try to enlarge Geneva from its traditional topics, from peace to health, also to science. We believe science is something that has to feed more into the multilateral system. So Switzerland has created a foundation. I always have to look exactly what it's called. It's the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator, GESTA. And the idea is really to have the results and also the prospect, of course, of scientific breakthroughs integrated into the work of the multilateral organizations, so that they remain up to date and do not just stay behind. And I think that's a big challenge, of course, that the UN organizations, I was glad to see the score, that they were still scoring fairly, actually quite well. They have to be up to speed. And I think that's a big challenge for them. And we provide also, we try in Geneva, of course, as a country, to have also the adequate locations and technology so that they can be part of this modern world. And that's really important.
Right. Well, I'm going to come back later and ask you a bit more about the Swiss example, because I'm always fascinated by this. One of the things people forget is that, you've managed to glue together 4 different language groups. And it wasn't so long ago, a few centuries ago, that they were all fighting each other, and yet now it's, living in harmony, which is extraordinary, or most of the time anyway. And I often wonder, what is the secret and how can you export that elsewhere? But Anne-Marie, from your perspective, having worked in Washington, now having the freedom of an independent think tank to comment, how do you assess the level of global cooperation? Do you think it's worse than it's been since you've been working? And, is there any source of hope in your view?
Oh, well, I'll start with hope. I mean, so many of the sessions that we've all been in have talked about the rule-based order, and that if Putin gets away with this, he fundamentally undoes one of the pillars of that rule-based order, which is that you cannot attack the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Pre-United Nations, that was fine. Right? I mean, there was the abortive effort with the League, but it's worth remembering that had this happened in 1922, or certainly in the previous century, there was no international law against doing that. So, the UN is there, it's established the norms, and this, I mean, if you think about 1991 in Iraq, the first Gulf War, if you think about now, there is a sense of a rule-based order, and many states, the vast majority, lined up against it. So that, and then you look at the expansion of all the specialized agencies. Imagine the world without UNHCR, just as one example. And I would say the World Health Organization as well. We wouldn't even know where to start. So I see plenty of cooperation. I do think, you know, it's the age-old problem. You have global issues that require collaboration across political lines, and you have geopolitics at the same time. So had we really done what was necessary, the United States and China, all the G20 countries, would have come together and said, we're going to vaccinate the whole world. And we're going to vaccinate them with Sinovac. Sinovac may be not as good as Moderna or Pfizer, but it's better than nothing. In fact, the United States didn't want to do that. It wanted to bring together its 100 countries, you know, its democracies, and it would do its vaccine campaign, and China then ended up doing the same. And that, you know, that's to some extent inevitable, that the geopolitics, the competition among big nations is going to scupper what we actually need from a global point of view. But I do think, and I would have pointed to CEPI, I would have pointed, I always point to Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, which has vaccinated 600 million children. Those are real numbers. So I think we're at a moment where if in 2045, we are still being run by the victors of 1945, the UN Security Council. The world thinks that's illegitimate. The G20's better, but it's still basically, those countries are the countries whose finance ministers were involved in the East Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. So we do have to come together, we have to figure out smaller groupings that are more inclusive. I think those smaller groupings can then, in fact, still connect to the UN agencies in ways that give us the ability to actually have impact. I don't think there's one template. I think there'll be many. I do think we need major reforms, but overall, yeah, we're better off with the UN than without it.
Right, interesting. I mean, I'd like to turn a bit granular and talk about some specific issues which need collaboration right now. Let me start again with you, Dr. Hatchett. You know, we now have headlines about monkeypox. When you look at something like, first of all, I think we'd all like to know how much...
I'd love to know what monkeypox is.
Okay, first of all, forget what we're talking about. We want to know about monkeypox. Is monkeypox a risk? And whether it's monkeypox or anything else, do you have confidence that when the next pandemic or epidemic or threat comes, the current systems are better placed than they were 3 years ago to cope?
I just want to point out that you know, first time we're back in Davos as another infectious disease crisis, and you can decide whether there's causality there or not, because it dominated the last time we all gathered together. I think monkeypox, I mean, one, monkeypox is not the same kind of disease in terms of its transmission as COVID. So we do not face a pandemic threat from monkeypox, but we do have a really challenging epidemic to resolve that has now spread globally in a community that in many places is still stigmatized, and securing the trust that will bring that community in and help us in the epidemic before it spreads further is going to be a challenge. I think monkeypox actually exemplifies what I would aspire to for the world for future pandemic preparedness, which is, imagine a scenario where monkeypox were either more virulent or more transmissible than it actually is. Well, we actually are in a world where we have 2 effective vaccines already. We have 3...
Sorry, 2 vaccines against monkeypox already?
Yes, the smallpox vaccines. Vaccinia,
right.
The smallpox vaccine is effective against monkeypox.
Right.
And the reason we have smallpox vaccines, and the reason we actually have 2, and the reason we have one that is specially targeted for immunocompromised people, is because the U.S. government led an effort to develop countermeasures against a related virus, smallpox, and then created stockpiles of those, and invested in creating antivirals against smallpox that fortunately are pan-orthopox, which is the family, pan-orthopox antivirals. And so we're heading into a new infectious disease crisis with countermeasures at hand, and we could deploy them. And I think we have the opportunity coming out of COVID, where we saw that prior investment in vaccines against MERS, which obviously Saudi Arabia was very concerned about, enabled us literally in less than 48 hours to design vaccines like the Moderna vaccine that are highly effective. And so we do need a global collaborative effort to develop countermeasure capabilities against other viral families where we're not as prepared. So that's the good news about monkeypox.
Yeah, I knew you were the good news agent. Cheer us all up.
I do think the systems of collaboration that we have created through, you mentioned the ACT Accelerator. If people aren't familiar with that, that's the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, which is a really interesting multi-sectoral effort to respond to the pandemic. It includes multilateral agencies, it includes nonprofits like CEPI, and it includes the private sector. And they have all come together to coordinate their work. It hasn't been perfect, but it is a foundation for future efforts. And I think we'll see, hopefully pieces of that at least will be institutionalized and we'll be better prepared for future crises.
Well, that's fascinating. I must say, my new word of the day is orthopox. I'd never heard that before. I'm now going to impress everyone by saying orthopox with great confidence. But anyway, but Minister Al-Khalid, we were talking before in the green room about some of the practicalities of the lived experience of collaboration and areas where there were still gaps. What would be on your wish list for the medical collaboration issue? I mean, do you want to have apps that tell us all whether we can travel or not, or what do you think needs to be done? And I'm going to talk about food in a moment, but I'm curious about your views on the pandemic issues from your perspective. What's on your wish list?
Well, obviously, investing across the value chain of preparedness is very important, from research and development, accessing data within the various communities, because each community has its unique challenges and how it responds, and that's how diseases come. They're from certain localities. So opening up, having consistent regulations, and then having those regulations shared across jurisdictions and geographies. We in Saudi Arabia, within 2 months of declaration of the pandemics, had a mandatory app in Saudi Arabia where everybody had to have it on their phone. It was illegal not to have it, and it certified your status, whether you've been in contact with a COVID case, and then ultimately whether you've been vaccinated, first shot, second shot, booster, whether you can enter certain areas or not, whether you can travel on an airplane. Very easy, very simple. Call Tawakkalna, you flash it, and you're in. Unfortunately, that same application is not compatible when you travel to another country. Airlines did not have compatible applications. So I think we need to first of all standardize to the maximum extent, and we need to have ways through multilateral organizations and platforms that we talked about today to have that compatibility. And we need to accept as individuals, as companies, as governments, that in order to be prepared for these crises of different sort, we will have to contribute. And we contribute sometimes by losing some of our freedoms, so we can't have your cake and eat it too. And I know there is a lot of debate within certain countries and certain communities about not wanting personal data to be shared, not wanting to be tracked. But the counter to that is you stand a much higher chance of dying as a result of not having access to these security platforms.
Right. Well, I'd like to turn to one of the issues which the audience have already asked a question about. And I say, do send your questions by Slido, which is food. It's obvious, we've all heard these very, very rousing speeches from David Beasley from the World Food Programme about the scale and magnitude of the potential crisis we face this year. There's also a lot of discussion in the corridors and in the side rooms about whether there's going to be a global food summit soon to try and address this, which will be a very interesting test of whether we can actually have meaningful collaboration or not. I'd like to ask you, Anne-Marie, since you were previously in a role where you were trying to encourage this kind of collaboration on behalf of the American government, do you think that food is one area where we're actually going to see more meaningful collaboration in terms of addressing the supply chain issues? Is this an area where we should be looking to the US for leadership, or is that just too 20th century?
No, well, ideally that would be 21st century focus on global issues. I'm fairly optimistic, both because this is an area, so this is an area where geopolitics in many ways and global considerations align, in that the crisis is being caused by climate to begin with, but most immediately by the war in Ukraine. That means the United States and Europe, I think Europe's going to play a very important role here, have a huge incentive in actually to gather other countries, because it's in many ways, you know, this is the result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We, those who are fighting that invasion, are now going to really work hard to make sure that the impact of that invasion is reduced. At the same time, you've got all the private sector companies, and this is like food here. I mean, this really, I mean, this is like medicine, where like the pharmaceutical companies, you can gather the global food distribution companies. You've got farmers in every nation. This is an area where it also advances thinking about, you know, I heard this morning, smart farming, both the immediate crisis, but then longer term, how do you increase yields in the face of drought? So I do expect that there will be some real collaboration. The other reason I'm optimistic is the UN has just done something that I think is sort of on the model of Gavi. It's created a global food systems coordination hub based in the Food and Agriculture Organization. Now this, again, you have the very bureaucratic UN organization, as we've seen over the last decades. And you've created something in it that is designed to bring together all the global actors. So again, scientists, civic groups, private sector. That is the secret to Gavi and CEPI. That's a way of building on the legitimacy of the UN system in the sense that all nations participate, but that often, that legitimacy or that participation undercuts effectiveness. But now you can bring in a lot of the effective actors as well. So I think food is a big test. I think we already have a model, and we have some of the infrastructure in place to address it.
Well, I'd like to turn to both of you to ask, you know, first, maybe I can start with you, Dr. Hatchett. Okay, what are your top tips from dealing with medical issues for what needs to be done with the food crisis? If you were to design a food summit right now and get things right that were got wrong 2 years ago, what would you suggest? Top 2 or 3 tips.
Well, let me start by saying what's interesting is that we took inspiration from the food security community in thinking about, you know, how to organize, and in thinking that it was possible to take threats off the table, effectively to take famine off the table. I do think that the idea of creating a forum, which it sounds like the UN has done,
An impact hub.
to bring together sectors and to facilitate collaboration between sectors as much as between states is as important to the solution as anything else. One thing that I'm observing as we reflect on the pandemic response is in IFPMA, which is the international association that represents the multinational corporations, just last night issued their lessons learned from the pandemic, and they also essentially extended an offer to sovereigns, which is that they said that the private sector companies will reserve capacity for global equity purposes if there are precedent conditions, if there is financing arrangements in place that allow for early advance purchase agreements, if there are guarantees of free flow of goods. And so instead of one sector yelling at another, telling the other sector what they need to be doing, they've said, this is what we can do, but these are the conditions that we need to be able to do that. And that's the kind of conversations we need to be having.
Well, that's fascinating. And again, that's not the kind of thing which grabs the front page headlines, but it's very interesting indeed to see that kind of change develop. Minister, from your perspective, what do you want to happen on the food front? Because as you mentioned, you know, the kingdom is very, in some ways, very vulnerable on this front.
Absolutely.
What do you want to see happen? Are you going to be, you know, volunteering to host a food summit? I think Egypt is going to be hosting it, but, you know, what do you expect to see happen? And what would you like to see happen?
Going back to the fantastic discussion on multilateralism, I think we need to realize that it only succeeds if the building blocks are right. And the building blocks are the states. Under the states, of course, you have the private sector, you have nonprofits, but the states have to do their thing, and they have to do it right, and they have to be to contribute. So each country that is part of the multilateral organization, no matter how poor, how small, need to invest, need to volunteer, and need to be transparent on their contributions and their needs. In Saudi Arabia, we have built a stockpile. We've also invested within the country to the maximum extent we could invest in agriculture sustainably to produce our own food, but we also invested with other countries that have land that could be cultivated and they didn't have the resources to cultivate it, bringing capital and know-how to increase their yields and to access those yields for our own needs. I would say on the food side, we focus on supply, and that's important. I'll talk about it, but we also need to talk about demand. There is a lot of waste in the food value chain, whether it's through logistics, consumption, and I think as we go through this crisis, let's not let it go to waste, as they say, and also look into our consumption patterns, especially in the rich world, on how food is being wasted and consumed. I would like to think that there is a lot of demand that could be eliminated without us losing. In fact, our health will probably improve along the way. In terms of supply, I think, again, transparency and trust. If every country was to share what their projections are on production, what they have in inventory, we eliminate some of the fear-mongering that's going on. Prices, I think, would moderate, and we would not have some of the apparent supply-demand disruption. And then we need to bring the climate, as Anne-Marie mentioned, into the discussion. We need to forecast the impact of the climate, manage the climate and energy transitions well, and invest in areas that would counter them in terms of finding alternative sources of food, alternative areas that could be cultivated.
Right. Well, I'd like to bring Secretary Loy in because I think your perspective is very interesting. We've had a number of people who've asked the question, which is how can international cooperation be fostered and encouraged in the face of increasing nationalistic interests and nationalism? And I said earlier, Switzerland's interesting in this respect because part of my family come from Graubünden across the mountains, and one of them works for the Swiss Army. They're Romansh speakers, so they really are a minority. And he served in Bosnia for a while, and I remember sitting around the table once where he was talking about the tremendous nationalist ethnic hatred in the Bosnian region that he was dealing with. And they made the point, of course, that was Switzerland 2, 3, 4 centuries ago. And, you know, so I said, well, how did it change? What's the secret sauce? And all he could say was time. And you might add money.
And money.
And money. But given the world doesn't have a lot of time or money, you know, and given that in some ways Switzerland has overcome this ethnic nationalist hatred, which we tend to forget, it's now taken for granted, you know, what advice do you give to the rest of the world? You know, I know Swiss can be very smug sometimes, but what advice do you give to the world in terms of how we deal with this and actually focus on international cooperation?
Well, thank you for the question. If I may quickly just say for the food, one thought, I mean, it's important to take lessons learned from the pandemic for the food crisis also. But there is a big difference. The pandemic, there is absolutely no choice of working individually in countries. Whereas, of course, in terms of food, you can, as a country, you can change your own policies and start being more independent. And I think that is something we've also heard in Davos now several times, you know, moving away not only in terms of food, but also in terms of energy, moving away from dependency. So you also have to be careful. What does that mean? Is that the end of globalization and then the end of cooperation? So we have to make sure that less dependency does not mean less cooperation and coordination. As for Switzerland, at that time, we weren't very rich. We were not always a rich country. In fact, we used to be a poor country. And yeah, with different languages, different religions. So we had some very difficult times in terms of history. And I think the fact was the secret, if you will, is to have policies where you protect minorities. So everybody for example, linguistic minorities. Everybody can speak their language, can use their language in official contacts, for example, but also in terms of religion, very important. We can see religion is often a cause for rifts. So also there, to have the tolerance. And of course, our political system is also one that does not give a huge amount of power to one of the institutions. There's a good distribution of power, and on top of all the institutions are the people, so the direct democracy. So we have a lot of checks and balances, if you will, that make sure that the balance is kept in place. And we work, of course, very closely with the countries. For example, in the Western Balkans, we have a lot of people from the Western Balkans living in Switzerland, so close ties, and who bring also back maybe some of these experiences.
Right. Well, if only we could extrapolate that to the United Nations and have that kind of trust-building exercise. Maybe we need a gigantic rotating cantonal system for the UN, which would solve things. But we're almost out of time. I have one last quick question, which is actually a very good question indeed, which is this. Each time a crisis happens, a new UN institution is established with another ugly acronym, and that's my words, not their question. Can't we streamline them and sunset them to actually direct resources to the most needed place?
Well, I can start because I am a member of the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, which is advising the Secretary General in the run-up to the Summit for the Future in 2023. And so effective multilateralism is exactly the perception that, yes, every crisis, there's a new organization, there are new groups, the groups like the G20 are there to end run the United Nations. So you have a huge proliferation of UN organizations and non-UN organizations, and that effectively what is now needed is at the very least to connect them and align them, if not to integrate some. It's very hard to shut things down. Trust me, having been in the university for 20 years, the academic centers are created, but they never die. But this is going back to this idea of hubs, right? You can connect a lot of these, you can align them. Ideally, I think if you take a Gavi or a CEPI, you can say to the world, all right, here's this organization, it's set a goal, say, 1 billion children vaccinated, just to take one. And you can measure us against that goal. To achieve that goal, we need to bring all the sectors together. If we achieve it, then we should get more funding and more support. If we don't, then effectively you just like you cut off the blood supply. And there, I think you could do that in a lot of the UN organizations, and then align the others in broad networks that would effectively be, here's the global network for not food, but take the SDGs, the 17 SDGs, go down a couple levels because they've got all these subparts. You could have a global network for each one of those that would at least align existing organizations, and those that are simply moribund would just be effectively cut out.
Right, thank you. Well, sadly, very sadly, we are out of time. I think there's a lot more we could talk about because you've all raised excellent points. I just say from my perspective, I really have 3 key takeaways. The first is that if you look at the situation on the macro level, it's pretty depressing right now. And we've all been in sessions for the last couple of days, which I think really left many of us feeling pretty dismayed. To put it mildly, the world is facing protectionism, deglobalization, growing nationalism, and economic problems, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess the second point I'll make is that listening to you, even if many of the big institutions may be fit for purpose, partly because they've not reformed and changed, on a micro level, there are many encouraging stories. And I do find the pandemic story fascinating and very encouraging. And I think one of the key questions now is how do we take those individual points of success, which are often tangible, granular and geeky, and actually try to replicate them in other areas and get policymakers and politicians excited about it. I mean, right now, it's good to be a geek. As you said, Minister, questions of management are really important right now. Questions of redundancy, slack, these are really, really important. And my last quick point is, at the end of Davos, if I'm feeling too depressed, I'm going to think about my new favourite word. Is it orthopox?
Orthopox.
No, orthopox, yes. Because therein lies potentially one reason why we don't need to panic about monkeypox, and why we do actually live in a world where collaboration does sometimes happen for the better. So let's hope we can go forward and replicate that. So thank you all very much indeed, and good luck in taking these principles forward in your own work. And good luck to all of you in the audience, and thank you for the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.